sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. After an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. The word of the Lord. About 15 years ago, I was sitting down in the lunchroom at the denominational building having a cup of coffee with a couple of my colleagues. This is something we did on a regular basis, and we had been doing this for about 2 years. The one colleague said to me, "I've decided to be your friend again." I asked him, "What did you say?" And he replied, "I said, I decided to be your friend again." "I didn't know we weren't friends," I said. "Oh, yes, about 6 months ago, I decided not to be your friend. I disowned you." Imagine my chagrin at thinking that for 6 months we had been meeting regularly over coffee and in other encounters, only to find out that he had no longer considered me his friend. And this was news to me, and it took me some time to recover from it. I remember my daughter, my granddaughters at different times talking about school friends who had suddenly refused to talk to them or inform them that they were no longer friends. How many of us have experienced that at one time or another? This happens so often in middle school and high school. And I had this same experience for the first half of my freshman year in high school. Friends with whom I had hung out during 7th and 8th grade all of a sudden pushed me out of their circle. We eventually got back together and finished high school as great friends, and we did everything together, but those first few months of high school were an agony. And I'm sure many of you may have experienced the same. Our passage this morning talks about being disowned, even if Andrew says he's not experienced that. I saw that shake of the head. This story is about being denied, but the story we just read in the scriptures goes much deeper, and it has eternal consequences, while what I lived through and you may have lived through was only temporary. So let's look at our passage. Verse 54. Verse 54 tells us that Jesus was seized by the soldiers, led away, and taken to the house of the high priest. This was not something unexpected by Jesus. Jesus, in verse 7 and following, had already sent Peter and John off to find a place for the Passover, and he told them, "As you enter into the city, that is Jerusalem, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you, and follow him to the house he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." And so we know this biblical story became known as the Last Supper. And Jesus, as he broke bread with his disciples, said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." We recently celebrated the Lord's table. Likewise, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, in my blood, which is poured out for you." And during this Last Supper, the all-knowing Jesus spoke of the one who would betray him. And even as they supped with the Lord, the disciples were disputing over who would be the greatest among them. Jesus then tells of his upcoming death. And to which Peter responds, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death." It's a bold statement, but one that Peter probably did not feel he would have to live up to. Peter, the impetuous one, who constantly spoke before thinking or acting before thinking. Jesus' response to him was, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. So how often have we made bold statements and later lived to regret them? We may proclaim undying love for a person only to fall out of love and turn our affections to another who ends up being the person we marry. How often we work for a company and declare we will finish out our working career here only to find ourselves in a couple of years moving on to something bigger and better. Yet we make bold statements just as Peter did. Peter was probably very sincere in what he said, but he felt if the time came and not when the time came, he was ready to accompany his Lord and suffer the same fate. Let's look at the last half of verse 54, and we read that Peter followed at a distance. It does not say that Peter walked alongside Jesus, nor does it say that Peter allowed himself to be manhandled and taken to the house of the high priest with Jesus. It says Peter followed at a distance. In modern day parlance, we talk about keeping our distance from someone. We may be in earshot and eyesight, but we are not walking alongside them. A person becomes an outsider or a pariah, and we immediately keep our distance from them. An unkind word or deed happens, and we no longer want to associate closely with that person who caused us the offense. There's something about keeping one's distance from another person. And this reminds me of an episode when my twin and I were in the 4th grade. We were both walking home from school that winter day when the class bully, who was to us was 6 feet tall because we were always short, he knocked my brother down and pushed his face into the snow, and I ran over and I knocked him down, allowing my brother to escape, and then the bully took his anger out on me and knocked me down and pushed me down into the snow face first. And my brother, several yards away, said, "Come on, Gary, we need to get home or we'll be late." He kept his distance. He was not there to help me. And Peter also was not comforting his Lord. He was not bearing his Lord's sufferings at the hands of the soldiers. He was near at hand and could see and hear what was happening, but in essence, he was trying to blend in with the crowd and physically distance himself from Jesus. And so there were 3 denials. Even worse than that physical distancing from Jesus would be these 3 overt, voluntary, verbal denials that are recorded in this 22nd chapter of Luke. This becomes so much more hurtful because Peter had just said, "Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death." So what was the first denial? Verses 55 through 57. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looked closely at him, said, "This man also was with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." Imagine saying to someone, "I do not know him," after spending 3 years intimately with Jesus, sharing meals, watching him minister, sleeping in the same room, conversing with Jesus, and professing to be willing to go to prison and to death, and then to make an about face and say, "I don't know him." Denial 2, verse 58. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." So not only did Peter deny knowing Jesus, he now says that he is not one of Jesus' followers. He claims not to be one of them. Denial number 3, verses 59 through 60. And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." So Peter first denied knowing Jesus. Then he denied being one of his followers. And in third instance, he denies having been with Jesus. Imagine being Peter at this time. And verse 61 says, "And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, 'Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and wept." Peter was only the first of many down through the centuries who would deny Jesus. During the Roman persecution, many fair-weather Christians willingly denied their faith. At the same time, many more refused to turn their backs on Jesus and willingly went to their death. Several years ago, we traveled with Patricia to France and Italy, and while we were in Rome, we went to the Colosseum. And as you walk through the Colosseum in the distance, across from where you're standing, you see a cross standing in the Colosseum. And it represented the thousands of believers who were thrown to the lions, or even those who were burned as human torches. Christians down through the centuries have suffered cruel atrocities, and it's no wonder that those whose commitment to Christ was feeble at most, and a mere emotional decision at best, denied him and cowered away into the shadows. Many Christians died in Rome and elsewhere. And there's a story about a clandestine religious service that was taking place in one of the former Soviet Union republics. And they were halfway through their service when all of a sudden the building was surrounded by soldiers, and several burst through the doors, walking to the front. And the person in command shouted, "All those who are Christians, stay where you are. The rest of you, get out of this building immediately before something bad happens." And once the people who were willing to deny their faith had left the building, the officer in command put down his weapon, took off his hat, and said, "We're believers like you, but we wanted to make sure that the room was filled only with those who had a true faith in Jesus." Today in India, in Syria, Iraq, and Iran, even as Todd prayed today, even at times in Chiapas, Mexico, Christians have had to make a decision to stand firm in their faith and profession or renounce Christ. And according to Partners International, every month there are 772 acts of violence against Christians somewhere in this world. It's becoming a crisis situation in many countries where declaring Christ, owning up to being a follower of Jesus, of knowing Jesus, could result in beatings or mutilations or incarceration or even death. But there are other ways of denying Jesus that are not as cut and dry as denouncing one's faith or claiming not to be a follower of Jesus as Peter did. How else do we disown or deny Jesus? One way is by failing to stand up for our faith. This may not be an outright rejection of Jesus, but by failing to stand up for him, it puts us into a gray area. When our Christian principles are being challenged and we're being asked or told to go against our beliefs in the name of political correctness or in keeping with current social mores, we're sliding towards the denial of the one whose lordship we claim to follow. When we are being encouraged, if not forced, to take pictures at a wedding we feel is not God-honoring, or to make a cake for a same-sex couple, we have a decision to make as Christians. When a business is forced to provide benefits that go against the owner's biblical beliefs, sometimes it means being willing to pay a fine or participate in a long, drawn-out court case. When laws or decrees or mandates are handed down that we feel go against our Christian principles and would anger our Lord, we do have a decision to make. In other ways, by turning our heads to avoid the uncomfortableness. There are times when we feel uncomfortable in a situation and fail to speak up. We may be moving closer to denying our Lord than we think. laughing at off-color jokes regarding religion, not saying anything when God's name is being taken in vain, ignoring outright slurs against our faith in which God's integrity and person are being challenged. Jesus did not say that living the Christian life would be easy, especially in today's society. The world at large is jaded when it comes to Christians. We've not always lived up to our own standards or beliefs and even demonstrated Christ's love for a fallen humanity. Matthew 10:33, Jesus said that whoever denies me before men, I will deny before the Father. But Jesus goes on to say in Matthew 16, deny self, take up your cross, and follow me. Our lives may involve suffering for His name's sake, as the examples I gave earlier confirm. Another way in which we can deny Jesus is by our hypocrisy. We read in Titus 1:16, they profess to know God, but they deny Him by their works. So maybe at this point you may be feeling you're doing pretty good. You confess Jesus as Christ, and you are proud to say that you're a Christian. But what does our life say? Is it possible for us to shout from the rooftops, Jesus is Lord, yet have messy lives that our words are drowned out? Paul speaks about false teachers in Titus 1 who deny God by their works, but any of us can also live in a way that contradicts what we say. Faith in Jesus will always challenge the way we live. So if our life looks like nothing has changed or there's something not right, our lust is a denial of God's good plans for sexual desire, our pride is a denial of God's place at the center of our lives, all of our disobedience in many different forms and formats is a denial of God's role as the rightful Lord of all creation and the God whom we profess. Our words may acknowledge Jesus, but do our works deny Him? Are we loving others as we should in John 15? Are we obeying Him in John 14? Are we bearing fruit in Galatians 5? Are we sacrificially giving ourselves and our resources to others in 2 Corinthians 8? Are we seeking God and His Word? Another way in which we deny Jesus is by denying His full divinity and humanity. I remember many years ago when I was young, there was a Bishop Pike, an Anglican bishop, who denied the divinity of Christ. But Schweitzer, in his book, The Historic Jesus, likewise denied the divinity of Christ while affirming His historicity as a good teacher, as a good man. Yet there are other ways that we can deny Christ. In researching our passage today, I found some commentaries that gave other ways in which we deny Him. See if you don't identify with some of these ways. We fail to regularly read our Bible, and yet we say we love Jesus and He is Lord and Master of our lives. We do not live like sons and daughters of the King. We're chameleon Christians, bending this way or that. We believe our faith can exist while living in shades of gray. We look to hang out with the in crowd. We fail to act when God tells us to. We serve the church while failing our spouses and our children. We fail to pray. We fail to rely solely on God's power. We fail to forgive others while expecting to be forgiven. We fail to walk alongside those who are suffering. We do not share our faith with others, and if our faith is that important, we should be sharing it. We fail to seek out friendships with those who are different from ourselves. We walk by those in need. So you see, our faith needs to be lived out. To not do so is to deny Jesus. It fails to put into practice what we profess to believe. It hides our faith away, or it compartmentalizes it. It reminds me of a question that I read once in a book where a person posed the question, if you were to be taken before the magistrates to be imprisoned for your faith, would there be enough visible evidence to convict you? I dare say for many of us, this gives us food for thought. Our actions or lack of actions deny the faith that we say we have. But there is good news. Even those who deny Jesus can be restored. After his resurrection, Jesus came near to Peter and confronted him. Jesus entered into the house where the disciples were, and he sat down and ate with them. And afterward, Jesus looked at Peter and he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter replied, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. So Jesus tells him, feed my sheep. But Jesus knows that Peter has denied him 3 times, so he asks him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And again Peter said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And so Jesus responds, tend my sheep. Then a third time Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? And the Bible tells us that Peter was grieved because Jesus had asked him a third time, failing to remember that 3 times he had denied his Lord. And 3 times Jesus had asked him if he loved him. And after telling him the type of death Peter would eventually suffer, he says to Peter, follow me. He received him back into his fellowship. He invited Peter to enter into his suffering. If we reject Jesus, if we deny him before others, if we fail to stand up for Jesus, Jesus is still ready to forgive us and to restore us. He is the God of second chances. And those who are with us from Teen Challenge can testify to that. And each one of us can testify to this fact as well. God gives us second chances while we still live. He wants to restore us. He wants to have a relationship with us. We do not practice a religion. We live in a relationship with our Savior. There may come a time, and it may even be here now, where believers in this country will be confronted with taking a stand for Christ in one form or another. So let us be found faithful to the one who gave his all for us, even if it means to suffer and to die for our faith. In Revelation, there are those saints who were even decapitated for their faith. And we see this happening in some parts of the world today. Decapitated for not denying Christ, but they gained a reward as they stood before the throne of grace. And may we equally be found faithful. To the God who sits on this throne of grace be all honor